Today's lecture is on the digestive system. Learning outcomes are to take a look at the organs of the digestive tract, as well as the accessory organs, and of course the roots, prefixes and suffixes, disorders of the digestive tract, and other medical terms. So here is the digestive system. Let's just take a quick run through all of these. Let's start in the front with the mouth, going clockwise over to the parotid gland, also one of the salivary glands. So we have the parotid, sublingual, and submandibular salivary glands. Then chewed food would move down the esophagus, being kept out of the lungs by the epiglottis, which is not there, through the diaphragm and into the stomach. The spleen will feed the digestive enzymes into the chewed and mixed food in the stomach. Next, we'll move into the, let's make sure we get into the duodenum, and which is the first part of the small intestine. And after we wend our way through the small intestine, we'll end up in the ascending colon. And there's the appendix. We'll come back to that, a residual organ at the very beginning of the large intestine. So ascending colon goes up. Let me get a different pen here. Ascending colon, of course, transversing across with the transverse colon. And then, of course, heading down or descending through the descending colon and into the sigmoid colon or S-shaped colon around this bend to the rectum and anus. And let's back up and get the other parts of the digestive system we'll be looking at. We got sigmoid, rectum, anus, cecum, beginning of the large intestine, pancreas, which is sending in enzymes, a lot of them for digesting proteins, and bile, which helps break down fats, the liver, the gallbladder, which stores the bile, liver, which produces bile. Of course, the pharynx up at the top, and then the trachea, which we studied in the respiratory system. So the three main functions of the digestive system is, of course, the breaking down of food, to absorb it, get the nutrients into circulation, and eliminate or remove the undigested food material. So these are a quick rundown of the organs, starting with the mouth and moving through the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small and large intestines. Now let's take a look at which functions are occurring in each spot. So in digestion, we first have to break down the food first by mechanical, that is the chewing and mixing. And they have to be broken down from being bite-sized pieces to be small enough to be absorbed. Food is moved by a process of peristalsis, that is the contraction of the smooth muscle that moves the food through the digestive system. Another name for the food once it enters and mixes with the digestive enzyme, saliva, and whatnot is chyme, or C-H-Y-M-E. In the mouth, there's mastication or chewing, which breaks the food down, and the saliva passes into the pharynx through the esophagus before ending up in the stomach. So here is that first part of breakdown from mouth to pharynx to esophagus to stomach. It is mixed with enzymes pepsin and hydrochloric acid, which breaks apart the chemical bonds in the food so it can be digested. So here's the mouth. I'm not going to go in this in terribly in depth, but you have yeah, nothing you need to worry about here other than this is where mastication and the initial mixing with saliva takes place. And moving further on, we are looking at the mouth, stomach, stomach to the small intestine, starting with the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, 3 parts of the small intestine. In the small intestine, you have many villi, singular being villus, which has veins, capillaries, and part of the lymphatic system as well, or lacteal glands, but it's just a part of the immune system. Also in each villi, this greatly increases the surface area of the small intestine. You can see all of these ridges and nicks and crannies, kind of like the surface of the brain. You could increase the surface area of the brain without increasing the size of the brain per se. Once we've moved through the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, we get to the beginning of the large intestine, or the cecum also, then ascending, transverse, and descending colons, ending up in the sigmoid and the rectum, and finally exiting via the anus. Let's pick up our with that cecum, ascending, transversing, descending, sigmoid, rectum, and anus. So let's look at some of these roots here really quick. I want to take a look at these. Feel free to pause the slides, of course. Moving on to accessory organs, organs that help in the digestion of food. Will start in the mouth with the salivary glands. Remember the parotid submandibular glands, and they have an enzyme that start the breakdown of starch. The liver has bile to break down fats, as previously mentioned. Gallbladder is where the bile is stored. And pancreas has a mixture of digestive enzymes, but here's where you'll start to see the breakdown of proteins. So here's a picture of those organs with the spleen, which is involved in red blood cells, if you remember that. But we have the pancreas right next to that, pancreatic duct, of course, where the enzymes are emptied into the duodenum. Remember that as part of the small intestine. We have the cystic duct coming out of the gallbladder, where the bile is stored that has been produced by the liver, that is sitting directly below the diaphragm. Some more roots, this time for the accessory organs. And terms that I have been mentioning throughout the lecture. Do you have any questions about those? We saw in the villi with the lacteal capillary inside the villi, part of the lymph system. Okay, these slides are moving way too fast. Feel free to pause them until you can read them and familiarize yourself with all these terms. Here's one. That thing hanging down in the back of your throat, I just like to say, is the uvula. Okay, moving on to clinical things that can happen in the digestive system. First, we'll look at aging. Taste and smell deteriorate. Decrease in saliva. Of course, tooth loss. Difficulty masticating. Digestive systems don't make as many enzymes. And peristalsis slows down the contraction of that smooth muscle, and that leads to constipation. Some other common diseases in the digestive system: appendicitis, peritonitis, remember all of the itises or inflammations, gastroesophageal reflux or GERD, inflammatory bowel disease or IBD, ulcers, cirrhosis, that's liver damage, hepatitis, an infection or inflammation of the liver, constipation, diarrhea, gastritis. Here we're seeing gastro or stomach inflammation, colon cancer, diverticulitis. We'll get into that one a little bit more, but you can already see it's going to be an inflammation of something in the digestive system, cholestasis, and hemorrhoids. Of course, can have infections and ulcers are when the lining of the digestive system breaks down and you allow digestive enzymes and hydrochloric acid in the stomach to start eating away at the underlying tissue. Can be caused by stress and certainly drugs such as aspirin and other non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs will contribute to ulcers. So let's look at a case study. He has heartburn for 10 years, and that has definitely gotten worse. And he has gotten an endoscopy. And we'll find out what an EGD is. And he was prescribed a PPI, or proton pump inhibitor, to help him out with that. So let's take a look at these two terms. Okay, esophagogastroduodenoscopy. Esophagogastroduodenoscopy. Got a supercalifragilistic, but EGD. Make life easy on yourself. So it's examining the esophagus, stomach, and the small intestine. So you see esophagus, gastro, and duoden. No. Esophagus, stomach, and small intestine. And really strung a bunch of roots together to come up with that one and tacked on a suffix or scopy. And a proton pump inhibitor, or PPI, that shuts down gastric acid production. The hydrochloric acid, or HCl we were talking about, hydrogen ions will stay outside of the stomach if you take a PPI. And stomach acid won't be nearly as acidic that way. Cancers of the colon and the rectum are the most common digestive system cancers. If you have a low in fiber and high in fat, that will predispose a person to cancer. And colitis, or the colon being inflamed, will also bring on cancer in a lot of cases. And there are drugs that will cause it as well. Polyps can be removed. They are precancerous, so you want to get those removed before they become cancerous. Again, you use an endoscopes to take a look at those lining of the digestive system to see if there is cancerous, and you might have to have it surgically removed to prevent the spread of the cancer, because as you could see earlier, especially when you're looking at the villi, there is a large blood supply and the lymph system is all right there, so those cancer cells can definitely spread very rapidly throughout the abdomen and blood system. And you need a stoma for waste to come out if you cut out the link between that area and the anus. So you have a stoma, which is a direct opening from the abdomen to the outside. And so we'll have a colonostomy in those cases. So let's look at those. There's a colonoscopy way down here at the beginning of the sigmoid colon. Here we have an ostomy that's been placed in the transverse colon. All of this half of the transverse colon and the descending colon, sigmoid, anus, all of this was cancerous and removed. And here we have a portion removed way at the beginning of the, before you even get to the ascending colon. So all is ascending, transverse, descending, sigmoid, rectum, and anus, all removed with a stoma right there at the beginning, right there at the beginning. Large intestine. If you get an obstruction from a hernia, that's an organ that's moving through the muscles of the abdomen. You can have stenosis or a narrowing, and the opening between the stomach, in this case, between the stomach and the small intestine, is too narrow. Stenosis, another name. Any time you see stenosis, you're talking about a narrowing. And intussusception is a slipping of the part of the intestine into the part below. And if you can't visualize that, let's take a look here. Here you see part of the intestine slipping into the part above it. Intussusception. And you can also have a twisting or volvulus. Twisting all the way around here. And of course, then this stops all the food and digestive material from moving through. I used to have a greyhound, a retired greyhound, and the deep-chested sighthounds are apparently particularly susceptible to a volvulus. Never had it, fortunately, in my case, but for those vet, the vet assistants out there, keep that in the back of your mind. And hemorrhoids are just varicose veins that are located in the rectum. So GERD, or gastroesophageal reflux. So gastric juices back up into the esophagus. At the bottom of the esophagus and the beginning of the stomach, the junction, there is a valve that doesn't work very well and allows the backup of the acids and enzymes and whatnot to back up into the esophagus and cause the reflux and heartburn. So to treat it, you can lose some weight, keep the head elevated, and when you're sleeping, to have gravity help pull that stomach fluid down away from the gastroesophageal junction. Avoid foods that are irritating. NSAIDs are the big culprits a lot of times when we're looking at GERD, and in worst case scenario, surgery to help with that junction. In Crohn's disease, you have chronic inflammation of the intestines, generally in the ileum. Remember the three parts of the small intestine. Pain, diarrhea, and abscesses, secondary bacterial infections can form. And ulcerative, you can see again an ulcer in the rectum that stays inflamed, and eventually the tissue is compromised and you end up with an ulcer in the rectum. On celiac disease, you have the inability to absorb the protein in wheat or gluten. In diverticulosis, there are small pouches in the wall of the intestine. A low fiber diet is a contributing factor. Once you have these pouches, you can get bacteria secondary to the waste products collecting in there, and you get the itis or inflammation in those pouches. And stool softeners and to keep the food moving through so that it doesn't have time to collect in the pouches and cause the problem. In hepatitis, we're talking about an inflammation of the liver. There are many types of hepatitis viruses. Hepatitis A, that is fecal oral contamination. Hepatitis B, or it could be spread in food. Hepatitis B is by direct contact with blood and other body fluids. Hepatitis C is close contact, usually with blood, for the virus to get moved across in hepatitis C. And there's now a cure for hepatitis C, but it is really expensive. It's usually about $10,000, I believe, for a full course of treatment. But if you weigh that against how much it costs for a liver transplant, it saves a lot of money, even though it is very expensive to get that element. Continuing with hepatitis, again, hepatitis D, that occurs at the same time as hepatitis B. And hepatitis E, we're back to food and water being the transmission source for hepatitis E. And G, another bloodborne pathogen. You can get vaccines for A and B only at this point. And cirrhosis is caused by excess use of alcohol. You can have megaly of the liver or enlarged liver. Edema ascites, which is a fluid buildup in the abdomen, and jaundice, which is too much bile being built up in the blood, and you get assume a yellow is tinged to the skin and the whites or sclera of the eyes. As it gets worse, you can get an enlarged spleen and end up with bleeding and brain damage eventually. Cholecystitis is an inflammation of the gallbladder, secondary to gallstones. And cholelithiasis is when you have stones in the gallbladder that eventually lead to cholecystitis. So cholelithiasis, you have the stones. Cholecystitis is when you have inflammation secondary to having those stones. So you can diagnose gallstones with ultrasonography, radiography, ultra, or sound, radiography, or X-ray, and endoscopic retrograde cholanangiopancreatography, or ERCP. And here we have a resected or removed gallbladder with a lot of stones, kidney stones inside the gallbladder. These drugs to dissolve stones are going to have a cholecystectomy to remove the gallbladder. Cholangiopancreatography. Cholangiopancreatography. So inflammation of the pancreas. Also, we're looking at oftentimes alcohol abuse. Pancreas is working overtime trying to utilize all of those sugars that come in the form of alcohol, drug toxicity, infections. All right, and here are a few terms that we've been going over. So ascites is the accumulation of fluid in the abdominal cavity. Yeah, didn't really go into hiatal hernias, but that's when the stomach moves through the diaphragm. I'm talking about occult blood. Sounds like some Satan cult, but it's actually just small amounts of blood. We have Duke's classification for staging colorectal cancer. And it goes from A to C. Okay, here are some abbreviations. If you don't want to remember that, just remember ERCP, EGD. BM is one you'll see in charting a lot, bowel movement. GERD is one you'll see with some frequency. All the hepatitises. That brings us to the end of our lecture. IBS and IBD you'll see commonly. Nasogastric tube, nasostomach, so a tube that goes in through the nose and into the stomach. PPI, of which we covered. Okay, and with that, we have come to the conclusion of our lecture on the digestive system.